Imagine confessing your sins to a priest, and that priest reports your revolutionary plans to the Spanish government. That's not a conspiracy theory. That literally happened in the Philippines, and it was just one tool in a 333-year machine designed to keep an entire nation broke, uneducated, and obedient.
Look, I know how that title sounds, and I need you to hear me out because what I'm about to walk you through isn't opinion. This is documented. This is historical. And the system I'm describing, it had 3 interlocking pillars: economic strangulation, educational lockdown, and a theological doctrine that basically told you God wanted you at the bottom. And here's the thing most people miss. The education part, it wasn't that schools didn't exist, they did, but they were weaponized, and I'll show you exactly how in a few minutes. But first, we got to talk about the land, because this is where the money was, and the money was obscene.
So, 1565, the Spanish show up, and almost immediately, religious orders, Dominicans, Augustinians, Franciscans, Recollects, start acquiring land. Royal grants, strategic purchases, century after century of accumulation. By 1898, over 400,000 hectares, prime agricultural land, controlled by friars. Let that sink in. 400,000 hectares. One source even specifies roughly 170,000 hectares held just by the Dominican, Augustinian, and Recollect orders alone. And the native farmers, they didn't own a single square meter of it. They worked it under something called the inquilinato system, basically share tenancy. You farm the land, you give a huge chunk of your harvest to the friar, and you pray you don't starve. And if you fell behind, mortgage foreclosure, land seizure, exorbitant rent hikes, you're trapped generation after generation. No way out, no way up. The friars were known to impose these exploitative practices against struggling tenants, further deepening their economic struggles. The result was a system of absentee landlordism and share tenancy that institutionalized landlessness and prevented the emergence of an independent peasantry. And then, on top of that, the church hits you with the diezmos prediales, a tithe, 1/10 of your produce, straight to the church. Not the government, the church. So you're paying rent to the friar and a tax to the friar. You're getting squeezed from both sides, and you can't leave because there's nowhere else to go. All the land is theirs. This wasn't poverty by accident. This was poverty by architecture.
Now, I told you there were 3 pillars, right? And yeah, the economic one is brutal, but honestly, the economic stuff is the easiest part to understand. You take someone's land, they're poor. Simple. What's terrifying, what actually kept this system running for over 3 centuries, is what they did to people's minds. And there's one specific detail about the confessional that almost nobody talks about. I'm going to get to that. But first, education, or should I say, the illusion of education.
Okay, so here's what they want you to believe. Oh, the Spanish brought education to the Philippines. The friars built schools. University of Santo Tomas, 1611. And yeah, those things existed. The Augustinians started in Cebu in 1665. The Franciscans, Jesuits, Dominicans followed. UST became the premier institution of higher learning. But here's the part they don't put on the brochure. Spanish royal decrees explicitly stated the goals of colonial education, and I'm quoting the document here. The goals were indoctrinate Christianity, promote the Spanish language, and instill loyalty to the Spanish crown. Not empower, not liberate, not develop critical thinking. Indoctrinate, promote, instill loyalty. This was a compliance factory, designed to shape a docile and obedient populace rather than to foster critical thinking or provide broad opportunities for advancement. And who got to attend? The Principalia, local elites, mestizos, people the colonial government could use. For the vast majority of Indios, access to even basic education was limited, and the goal was never universal literacy. Higher education was almost exclusively controlled by the religious orders and remained a privilege for a select few. Institutions like UST, while prestigious, produced a small number of Filipino graduates who were integrated into the colonial elite.
The existence of these elite colleges, alongside institutions like Colegio de San Juan de Letrán, which catered specifically to mestizos, demonstrated that the church was invested in creating a subordinate class of educated natives who would serve the colonial order. And here's a question for you. The Philippines was a Spanish colony for over 330 years. 330! So why is the Philippines not a Spanish-speaking country? Why didn't the language stick? Because they didn't want it to stick. Missionaries learned the local languages, Tagalog, Cebuano, Ilocano, to preach, but teaching Spanish to the masses, that was strategically curtailed, because if Filipinos could read Spanish, they could access new ideas, political philosophy, Enlightenment thinking, revolutions happening in Europe, and that would threaten the friars' authority. So they kept the masses in the vernacular, kept them dependent on the friar as the only translator between them and the outside world. 3 centuries, and a language never spread. That's not an accident. That's policy.
And the 1863 educational decree supposedly opened up primary education. Sounds great, right? Except its effects were so gradual, so watered down that the fundamental power dynamics didn't budge, not even a little. The system gave you just enough literacy to fill out a tax form and recite a prayer, and that was it. That was the ceiling, by design.
But here's the thing. You can take someone's land, you can lock them out of school, but eventually people get angry. They push back, they rebel. So how do you stop that? You make them believe their suffering is God's will. Enter limpieza de sangre, purity of blood, imported straight from 15th century Spain, an ideology that judged a person's worth based on their lineage, specifically their freedom from Jewish or Muslim ancestry. And in the Philippines, it was twisted into a full-blown racial caste system. At the top, peninsulares, Spaniards born in Spain. Below them, criollos, Spaniards born in the colonies. Then mestizos, and at the very, very bottom, the natives, labeled indios. And that word, indio, it wasn't just a label, it was a brand, a mark of inferiority. It stripped Filipinos of their pre-colonial identities and reduced them to a subjugated category defined by their perceived inferiority. And the doctrine said no amount of faith, no amount of money, no amount of devotion could erase that blemish. Your blood was the problem, and you couldn't fix your blood. No amount of money or influence could erase this perceived blemish on one's bloodline. Even within the church itself, convents and religious orders sometimes demanded proof of limpieza de sangre from female candidates seeking admission. Think about that. The institution preaching all are equal in God's eyes was checking your ancestry at the door. And the friars? They framed all of this, the poverty, the hierarchy, the subjugation, as a divine natural order. They argued it was nothing less than the material reflection of the spiritual hierarchy ordained by the Creator. God made you this way. Your suffering is holy. Your place is at the bottom. And questioning that, that's not just rebellion, that's sin. This theological justification made the oppression seem inevitable and righteous, discouraging resistance and fostering a sense of acceptance among the subjugated populations. So now you're poor, you're uneducated, and you believe God designed it that way. You don't fight, you don't question, you endure. That's not religion. That's a cage with a cross on the door.
Now, remember I said I'd get back to the confessional? Missionaries would encourage revolutionary soldiers to confess, to unburden their souls. And in that sacred, private, sealed space, the friar would steer the conversation. Where are your comrades hiding? What are your plans? Tell me, my son, cleanse yourself of the sin of rebellion. And the fighter, believing this was between him and God, would talk. And the information went straight to Spanish authorities. The confessional wasn't a sacrament. It was an interrogation room with a crucifix on the wall. It transformed a sacred space of personal solace and spiritual guidance into an instrument of state security, further cementing the friars' political power and ability to suppress dissent.
And here's where it all clicks together. This wasn't three separate problems. This was one machine. Three gears turning in sync. Gear 1, take their land, make them dependent, extract their wealth. The economic engine of land concentration and tenancy created a permanently impoverished mass of tenant farmers. Gear 2, control their education, withhold language, prevent critical thought, keep them administratively useful but intellectually powerless. The educational system, focused on indoctrination rather than empowerment, ensured they remained without the tools for critical thought or upward mobility. Gear 3, convince them God ordained all of it. Make their chains feel holy. Make their poverty feel earned. The doctrinal framework of limpieza de sangre and the divine sanction of social hierarchy provided the moral and theological justification for this entire structure, presenting systemic oppression as a natural and righteous order. And the result, something historians literally call friarocracy. The friars weren't just priests, they were landlords, tax collectors, school administrators, political operators, moral authorities, all at once. In their territories, they functioned as sovereign rulers. Their control over land gave them economic power. Their control over schools gave them social and intellectual authority. Their control over doctrine gave them spiritual and moral legitimacy. This concentration of power explains why the system proved so resilient to change and why the friars were able to amass such vast fortunes and influence. And the system was so airtight, so self-reinforcing, that even when the Americans showed up in 1898 and tried to break it up, the Friar Lands Act of 1903-1904 buying church estates to resell to tenants, it still didn't work. Prices were too high, bureaucracy was too slow, the land just reconcentrated into private hands. The structure survived, the people stayed landless. Simply transferring land from religious to secular ownership did not automatically dismantle the underlying structures of inequality. 333 years of engineering, and the damage didn't just evaporate because a new flag went up.
And look, if this is the first time you're seeing these pieces fit together, if something just clicked, smash that subscribe button and hit that notification bell. The land inequality? Still there. The weak middle class? Still there. The culture of patronage, of dependency, of just accept your lot in life? Still there. 3 centuries of design don't vanish in one generation. The deep social divisions and inequalities that persist in the Philippines can be traced back to the foundations laid during this colonial era, where religion was inextricably linked with the mechanisms of control and extraction. But here's the thing they never wanted you to know. It was designed. It wasn't natural. It wasn't God's plan. It wasn't the way things are. It was a choice made by men in robes. And choices can be unmade, but only if you see the machine for what it is.